I think we just have to hit home that like if when you're in doing this sort of group work, and then you have someone like we always call out Leslie Brissett, who's like a magician. He like says something that's happening that you like sends a shiver down your spine. You're like, my God,
Yeah.
it's like it's magic.
It's a superpower.
Yeah, it really is.
It's incredible when somebody can read a group at that level. I mean, I don't think either of us can compellingly convey what that experience is like, but
Until
you
you
know
do.
it when you see it if you're paying attention.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Aodhan and Brant. They are co-authors of the book Gods, Heroes, and Groups, Relational Dynamics through Mythic Archetypes. I think we're going to have a great conversation today. So guys, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, definitely. So before we get into the book itself, can I get just a little bit of background, bio information, education background, interests, professional kind of stuff for each of you?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I started my real interest in the world of psychology, I think, started when I stumbled or bumbled into wilderness therapy in 2011. As a guide, I was in that kind of post-college curiosity stage, and a friend of our family recommended I look into that. Had big light bulb moments come on as that work was very immersive, doing 8 days on at a time, working with small groups in like the North Georgian wilderness, and had some pretty big insights around my own patterns as I was, learning these tools and working with the kids in that population. I went back to school to do graduate work at Columbia in social organizational psychology, and was there introduced to group relations conferences, which are probably going to be a little bit of the subject of what we talk about today, but experiential here and now work, looking at the dynamics in the room, which is really uncomfortable work, but also very revealing. And that was kind of a shift for me. It changed how I looked at groups. I think I did the math, it was like 10,000 hours working with clinical populations at that point. And just even after one group relations conference, I was having a paradigm shift. And so that kind of launched me on a trajectory. I've been in management and kind of director roles with a few different organizations, one nonprofit that did rites of passage for adolescents, and then other therapeutic adventure-based experiential organizations. And currently I'm doing therapeutic consulting with a group in the Southeast US.
Yeah. And for myself, I actually came into psychology with a background in technology. And it was while working in tech that I sort of got exposed to the likes of, say, Campbell and Young, and they sent me down a rabbit hole that eventually led me to leave and pursue studying psychology full time. So I left the tech industry, and in that sort of bridge, I also came across this group relations work that Brant mentioned, and that was just as COVID was happening. So since then, I've done about 10 of these intensive conferences, about up to 2 weeks residential. And I also met Brant actually at one of these, and that's eventually what led to the co-authorship. And right now I'm pursuing a graduate study in clinical psychology.
Thanks, guys. So tell me about this book. Like, what is the theme of the book? How did it come to be?
Yeah. The theme, quick pitch, so to speak, is that there's a world of literature called the mythopoetic movement that comes out of post-Jungian thought, basically, but this idea of looking at myth as profound metaphor. So applying a mythic framework with an analyst mindset. And my first introduction to this was Robert Bly's work, Iron John. He's looking at a German fairy tale and applying that to the development of the masculine psyche, and also looking at like a societal lens of where we're kind of falling short. There's also all this literature on group dynamics, specifically from like a leadership lens. You'll see a lot of books targeted towards business leaders that looks at modern frameworks around the study of groups. But what I was not seeing, and what we weren't seeing, is those two fields talking to each other. And so that application of mythic metaphor to a group study lens, there's just not a ton out there. There's like a Norwegian author. He's Norwegian, right? Moxnes?
Yes, Norwegian, yeah. Paul Moxnes.
Yeah, Moxnes.
Sure, he's written one in Norwegian. It's quite a crazy name.
Yeah, and I haven't even read that. But basically, to me, there's this niche that could be very fruitful. I think we can all agree that we're at a time in human history where there's deep polarization. Group dynamics are extremely relevant. The temperature feels pretty hot, so to speak. And so our hope would be that this synthesis of mythic metaphor and modern frameworks of understanding group behavior can be synthesized and help with the level of inquiry there.
Yeah, and that's where like me and Brant also linked up, is that at these conferences, online, people are coming in with all this sort of technical jargon, and the part of them is, like in, everyone's trying to be the best student, and, everyone's trying to have the best interpretation and say the best thing to impress everybody. And then what the purpose of story, is to make something very experiential and understandable. And we really linked on that at the conferences. We had this big link around myth and like neo-Jungian work. Like Robert Bly, Robert Moore. I'm sure you've heard of the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, these sorts of big imaginative works. And then that's what eventually led us to come together. But I guess part of the impetus is that, like, if you've read any Jung or Campbell, it's that like stories that have stayed in cultures over time. So they've been stayed across time, across culture. They obviously have something that's very sticky for the human mind, and they stay around and they tell us something about the nature of humanity. And then that's sort of what set us up to use the myth and to paint the group dynamics with stories, to try and make it more understandable and relatable.
That's good. Can you give me some examples of how, like, mythology, I mean, is it Greek, or like what different traditions do you come from, and how does that play into kind of fostering this group dynamic?
Yeah, we definitely lean on Greek for sure, but we do try to draw in various other traditions and stories as well. So it's not, we're drawing, I think the sentence that we use in the book is that the myths that we choose are a function of our understanding of groups, our knowledge of mythic literature, which is incomplete. Neither of us is a mythological scholar. We have an interest in it, and just, like a limitation in our own intellect and what we're able to connect. But we use a lot of Greek, like the Trojan War ends up being a really phenomenal metaphor, in my opinion, for conflict and looking at how conflict plays out in groups. We use Odysseus's journey back in a few different ways, but looking, like, one of my favorite chapters is looking at this idea of an organization that gets caught in what we call crisis compulsion. And so if you know anything about Odysseus' story, after he helps with the winning tactic of the Trojan War with the Trojan horse, there's this whole other story of him trying to get home with his crew. And it's misadventure after misadventure. And, folks that have spent time working with teams in organizational life and maybe corporate life, some of that might sound a little bit familiar. It can feel at times like, at least I've been on teams where just kind of like waiting for the next crisis to roll through. And what I like about that Odysseus' return home as a metaphor there is that we make the case that leaders who are not fully prepared in the function of leadership will often look to crises as a way of alleviating anxiety and bringing it down, basically making visible sacrifices in lieu of the higher functions of leadership. So if I'm promoted off the line as a competent worker, well, let's say in like a therapeutic organization, since we're all a little bit in that world, but if I'm a great therapist, for example, and that gets noticed and I'm promoted to be the clinical director, for example, typically you're not going to see folks that have had leadership training that get promoted. It's usually the folks that have done a good job with referral sources, have had good results with clients, things that make sense on the surface as promotional factors, but what you end up having is you have these hyper competent people at one level who step into leadership and haven't been prepared for that leadership function. They know really at a phenomenal level they can put out those fires when crises come up, but they don't feel comfortable in the higher level leadership functions. And so the group unconscious goes to what it's comfortable doing, which is putting out fires. And so we look at like Odysseus' journey home, where he's constantly angering the gods. He's running into different sorceresses and these kind of like wizard figures that are either giving gifts or taking away gifts or bumping into the Cyclops and the monsters. And so we can look at that as a good metaphor for that group, some part of the group seeking out these conflicts because that's what it knows how to manage effectively.
I think it might be a good idea to try and sort of explain what the group relations work is, so that people listening can have an idea of like what it is we're talking about. But yeah, like just at an experiential level, group relations is essentially, it can be a group of like 30 to 100 people in a room. And the purpose of the group is to talk about what's happening in the here and now, right now. And then that can lead to a whole host of reactions. It's super uncomfortable because people don't want to generally talk about how they feel about people in the room right now. So as you know, you're in the therapeutic world as well. The transference and the counter-transference can be super uncomfortable. And like in organizations, all of this stuff gets pushed down because it's not helpful to move towards the primary task, whatever that is, in like, whether it's sales or new customers, acquisition, all this kind of stuff, all those words. And so the purpose of group relations is to basically get together in a group, right? With the sole purpose of exploring what's happening in the here and now between each other so that everything is sensitized and brought up from the unconscious, and you deal with all of the conflicts across race, gender, everything.
Attraction, competition, all this stuff that we do not like to talk about in normal day life.
And it just, it all of your, your patterns and everything that sort of hurts you in the real world just comes up, and you have to deal with it because it gets reflected at you. So it can be super intense. It's not for everybody. Like, people have left these conferences, like, you have to be pretty stable going in because it brings up a lot of things that are very uncomfortable. But yeah, it's incredibly, incredibly rich learning. It's the best learning experience I have, without a doubt, ever come across. It's the learning method. Excuse me.
Can you give me an example of some material or some topic that might have come up that upset someone so much that they had to like walk out?
I could talk. I have like a story I always go to that makes me uncomfortable every single time, and it's me. So yeah, so I guess it requires reading a myth. So do you know the myth of Circe?
Oh yeah, it was the goddess who held Odysseus.
Yes, so she's basically a temptress archetype, right?
Yeah.
So let me read the myth. Odysseus and his men land on the island of Aea, home of the goddess and sorceress Circe, whose home is encircled by strangely docile lions. She invites Odysseus's men to a meal of honey, cheese, and wine, which she has laced with a magical potion. And on eating the meal, Odysseus's men turn into pigs. So I used this in the book to explain how, say, attraction can take a group off task, and I'm basically the main protagonist here, fortunately or unfortunately. Yeah. So I was at a conference, and we're at this conference for about 4 days already of like 2 weeks. And 4 days into the conference, there's a specific event that starts called an intergroup event. And you're asked to organize yourselves into groups based on specific themes. So I think I went ahead and tried to organize a group. It didn't go well. And I just noticed that there was this one woman who was constantly sort of piquing my attention throughout the conferences. And I noticed her from a previous conference. And these sort of same dynamics of being very suggestive and very sexual in her speech and her undertones, and she complimented my pectoral muscles and all this kind of stuff. And I just remembered that, and then I joined this group that she puts together, not really like thinking about that clearly at the time, but on reflection, which I'll get to later. So I joined this group, and I sort of start to realize that, oh, why? That's actually why I joined the group. Just this sort of base instinct. It wasn't really out of like an agency or, a purpose other than that. And I remember sort of getting quite annoyed and like shameful, right? So then I sort of go in on myself, which is my pattern that I have. I kind of withdraw, and the energy is just sucked out of this group. It's as if a black hole where I am sitting, and it just gets so intense that they're asking me to like speak up, like, what's wrong with you? And I end up just leaving the group, and I just doing that for the evening. And I come back the next day, and not knowing if anything was going to change or what was wrong, I was determined to try and make something else happen. So things are moving along nicely. We sit down into the session, and the same thing happens again. Stuckness. It's like waving through like honey or something, right? And then eventually I'm sort of sick of this, I'm sort of in on myself, and I ask the group to help me point out like what's going on here. And the specific woman in the group, she's pretty good in this work. Like, she's a lot of experience. She said, "You're jealous of the dynamic between me and this person here. Like, it's like sort of almost unreciprocated attraction on some level. And you're jealous of this. And I was like, what? Is that actually what was happening? And I remember seeing interactions outside of the group. Then I was like, yeah, that's actually what's happening here. Like, I'm not the apple of her eye. I'm not the center of attention of the group or something. And it just sort of like a pressure valve was released and everything started to work in the group again. It sort of blew my mind. And just back to the myth. So when Odysseus goes to rescue his men, the messenger god Hermes tells Odysseus to eat the molly herb to protect himself from Circe's allure, and then lunge at her when she tries to strike him with his sword. So Odysseus follows Hermes' instruction, and Circe immediately changes to friendly and helpful, eventually becoming his lover. So the molly herb throughout this old literature is generally associated with sort of a coming to consciousness, like throughout like Stoics and Neoplatonists and Christians. And I guess there's something there about coming to consciousness of my sort of unrequited envy or unrequited attraction, that causing envy, that sticking the group, and using this myth to try and paint that.
What's cool about it too is there's just, it's not, we see jealousy in groups all the time, but most of the time it's unconscious, and it just like a profound effect that even just a little bit of a shift of bringing that material up into the conscious can have with somebody who's even a little bit curious about it, right? Like, so, hey, Don, you said just an immediate shift in the group energy when you were able to kind of acknowledge that, right? Yeah, there's another example that we go over in the book, which was one of the most mind-blowing I'd ever seen of a scapegoat dynamic that happened at one of these conferences. It's like hilarious and tragic, and I think that the bigger implications are pretty wild as well, but just these are usually filled with fairly liberal. You could probably draw like a pretty accurate archetype based on like the 5-factor personality model of like who ends up in the chairs at these conferences, because it's usually at a graduate institution or some sort of higher ed program.
PC.
Is that
PCTC?
And well, so you get fairly well educated people. Pretty common that you see like that defense mechanism come up where one of the ways people avoid the work is by over abstracting, using very flowery language. My joke is that you'll see like people taking turns raising their hand to like say some nonsensical fluff that's like, yeah, well, this really makes me curious about the intersectionality of identity, and really at the core of getting stuck in the binary, perhaps we find that justice isn't so easy to grasp. And you're like, what the fuck does that mean? So I don't know if I can cuss this.
So it's like academia.
What that person is trying to say is, I really fucking hate you.
Yeah. Well, you'll see a cycle, and you'll see people like it's like a mode that the group gets into. Good consultants who are hosting these conferences will interject and bring some attention to it, because you have like some consultants or confederates that are sitting in the groups basically and helping to draw the group's attention to the patterns that are emerging. But it's fascinating because you will see that pretty commonly, and it's not that these are like bad people, but it's like a protective mechanism. It is a defensive way of trying to. You had asked about how we use like myth to conceptualize some of the group dynamics. Like one of the first things we talk about is looking at Wilfred Bion's ideas, adopted from Kleinian ideas, around the dilemma that people face when they have to join a group. And the dilemma is that on one end of the spectrum, if you miss the mark, you can become alienated, you can become rejected by the group, and that's like scary as hell at a really core level. Evolutionarily, like people that were rejected by the group didn't survive effectively. We have it coded into us that it's like a big deal to be accepted by the group. And then on the other flip side of that is total immersion into the group identity, to where you don't preserve any of your individuality. And so like this dual dilemma, and we have to kind of find that sweet spot in the middle where we can be a part of the group and also retain some individuality. And different groups will help for less healthy norms around that make that possible or not. But we use the metaphor of like the Norse creation myth, which uses fire and ice as like kind of the beginning. The beginning of creation starts with fire and ice, and eventually like where those meet, Ymir, the frost giant, is able to like come into being. But it's like you have to like find that middle ground basically.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think I was originally going to try to tell the scapegoating story that we use in the book. I don't know if that's
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, okay. Got off on my other track. So at a Boston conference full of intellectuals, again, most of these are therapeutic professionals or consultants to organizations, pretty well-to-do folks that with a high level of education. Probably the average education in the room is like a master's degree. And also probably fair to say that the average person leans liberal and politically. And so there was this guy there who, my estimation on like the first day, my first impressions of him, he seemed bright, sensitive, very liberal. He was like a gay, middle-aged guy. He did have a slight resemblance in terms of the color palette with Donald Trump. So I don't know if that plays into it. This would have been in probably like 2020 or 2021. Wait, no. Earlier. This was in maybe 2018, 2019, actually. So we're in Trump's first term. Lots of feelings around all that. The group loves to try to distract themselves away from the dynamics in the room by uniting around a dislike of certain political characters, whatever. But we can feel the tension. There's just like a preloaded tension culturally around these political issues. Everyone coming into the room, like, as that brings in something with them. And he made a comment that was something about his way of framing it was that America had tried to overcorrect, is what he used the phrase, overcorrect from Barack Obama. And the group, you could feel people bristle. He seemed like very liberal, but the way he said it made it sound like Barack Obama was a mistake. And you could feel people bristle. And I remember, I've been through quite a few of these at that point, that you kind of can feel it in the air when the group is auditioning somebody for a scapegoat role or looking for someone to blame. As soon as that happened, I had this like, oh, okay, thank God it's not going to be me. And what we saw with this guy was just his level of awareness and the like Velcro that comes when we get stuck in a role. It was like just very intense to watch. He became decreasingly aware of even his like body language and his volume. I would watch him again, he's like a sensitive gay liberal man, but he would like lean back and accidentally drape his hand too close to the groin of the woman behind him, kind of thing. And you could just feel like the fury and the rage like building in other group members. Again, these are adults. This isn't a clinical population. You're not dealing with like a treatment center. Otherwise, I would assume fairly well adapted adults. I was watching certain members, as soon as he would start talking towards the end of the conference, they would start like shaking and like crying. And it was absolutely insane. At one point, he had some big public argument. Every large group that we sat in with the whole membership when we were doing the here and now work, it would just turn into I don't want to say his name, but it would turn into the show, basically watching. Just knew as a group member that he was going to hold all the awkwardness for us and all of the conflict. If you got into any sort of hot water, you just had to shut up and let him do his thing. So he was like holding all that for us. And we use the metaphor in the book of Atlas holding up the sky, where we traditionally think of the scapegoat role as just like, who the hell would want to do that? That sucks. It's just like it's just a bad situation with no upside for whoever is doing that. But the point that we make, I doubt we're the first ones to make this. Steve Creamy actually talks about the roots of the word scapegoat and like how it's doing something for the group. But he was holding up something for us. Like we knew where the receptacle was for all the projected material we didn't want to own. And so, yeah, I mean, he had this like public argument with a few people. It got so blown up that he just stormed out of the room in the middle of the session. Like marches out, slams the door behind him. And the awkward silence when that dude left the room was, the air was just like thick. And everyone in the room is like, I do not want to be the one to break this silence. And then with what I would call some of the most brilliant comedic timing I've ever seen, right as the group is starting to like think about opening up conversation, the door freaks back open. And this dude, as if like summoned by the group psyche, just kind of slinks back into the room. And everyone breathes like a sigh of relief, it seemed like to me. Because, okay, we got our scapegoat back. We do not have to, the group doesn't have to deal with the anxiety of being out of equilibrium. We know what to do when this guy here has taken on this role. We kind of all understand how to interact with that. But when he was wrenched away from the system, suddenly the group was in disarray temporarily. And I think everybody probably at some level realized the threat there to themselves of, am I going to be the scapegoat if this guy's gone? Because the groups that do expel a scapegoat, it's not like the scapegoating dynamic goes away, just that individual. And typically those groups are often going to just slot somebody else right back into that scapegoating role.
And I think that was like one of the main examples of like this sort of almost archetypal dynamic, is that this scape dynamic is like there's a role that people almost slot into always. And Brant, what did the consultants say? Did they say anything about this guy, or were they also stuck in the...
Yeah, it's funny. If you, Ryan, at least my experience in this work is you will remember certain comments that consultants make because it's like, whoa, that made me feel a certain way. But when you ask me that, Aodhan, it's like, I can't think of anything. The volume was so high on what the group was doing, and yeah, I cannot remember any of the consultations, which is weird. Usually they'll like be flashbulb moments.
Yeah, I think we just have to hit home that like if when you're in doing this sort of group work, and then you have someone like, we always call out Leslie Brisson, who's like it's like a magician. He like says something that's happening that you like send a shiver down your spine. You're like, my God, yeah. It's like, it's magic.
It's a superpower.
Yeah, it really is.
It's incredible when somebody can read a group at that level. I mean, I don't think either of us can compellingly convey what that experience is like, but you know it when you see it, if you're paying attention.
Yeah.
Just the last little thing on that scapegoat, one of the points that I think is really important for any leader or group facilitator or therapist or coach is that recognizing that the scapegoat dynamic is like a co-signed agreement at some level. And I've been accused of victim blaming for putting this perspective out, but what I'm trying to convey is that there are benefits to it. You know, the scapegoat is generally, except in certain sidebar cases, there's generally less responsibility to perform, which can lower the anxiety. You get attention from the group. And so we see it in family systems, right? Kids acting out as a way of getting attention from parents pretty often when they aren't getting needs for affection, needs for attention met in other ways. Like the acting out is one of the things that people go to. The scapegoating dynamic, I believe, functions somewhat similarly in that you're getting your needs for attention met. You mean something to the group. There's a power in just like holding that role. Even though you're being viewed through a darkened lens, like you are providing something at a psychological level for the group. You're important in some way. So there's like lowered expectations and attention goes up. I'm not saying that this is some conscious decision or the fault of the person who steps into that scapegoating role, but I do think it's important to understand what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with just a crappy situation. Sometimes the scapegoat themselves are unconsciously really defensive of their role and holding on to that, and they'll really cooperate with the rest of the system to keep it in place. So if you're, as a facilitator or a therapist, I mean, you'll likely experience a lot of frustration with the scapegoat if you're earnestly trying to disarm the dynamic, and they find, just like I was saying, the comedically awful thing to say at the worst possible time. You're like, come on, man, like help yourself out here, right?
I think Jung called the Oedipal situation like a conspiracy, because both his thing was both the parent and the child knew exactly what was going on unconsciously. So they both signed, as you say.
So, you talked about this kind of political situation that leads to a scapegoating role, and compare that to Atlas trying to hold up the world, holding up, the rest of the group. What else does mythology have to say, in your interpretation about the political dynamics of the world we live in? It could be the dynamics of group relations like you're talking about, or just society more broadly.
Yeah, we a good amount to say on that. I will say that in our book, we do try at least to straddle kind of the observant middle ground to be able to see like dynamics on both sides, because I do think we can actually look at very clear instances of groupthink, ways that folks on both sides of the aisle really dim their awareness with like the stories that get recycled and told. But one of the metaphors that we use is the Trojan War itself, which is an interesting storyline in mythology, because it's not really like a clear good side, bad side. You see folks that are dragged, even gods are dragged into this conflict by discord, throwing an apple into the midst of the Olympians and saying like, oh, this is for the fairest. And so immediately there's competition and strife between three goddesses competing for the apple. The mortal Paris is involved in it to be the judge and is promised by Aphrodite to beat the hand of Helen. This is like convoluted storyline that just like sucks in everyone. And you have these two city-states involved in this 10-year war where gods are switching sides. You see which reminds me of when big news stories drop nowadays on Twitter or whatever it is. Sometimes I'll have an idea like, oh, this is going to divide people along these lines right here. Like progressives are going to interpret this as one way and like be in support of this. Conservatives are going to fall on this other side and be against this specific whatever issue. And I'll sometimes be surprised at how those lines get drawn, which has a similar feel to the Trojan War where, like Athena is like kind of on the fence and helping out. You'll see allegiances shift and it's like this really amorphous thing, but each side has its heroes. Each side has a sense of like purpose in the conflict. And, you can kind of like steel man both sides of the conflict. And there's also, I think, noteworthy is that the Trojan War stems from this death drive, this destruction drive, where Zeus is playing with the idea of using the conflict to destroy civilization, to like clear out mankind. So I think that's like another interesting little piece to consider there. So I don't know if that was at all helpful. That's kind of where my mind goes. We talk a lot about specific archetypes and things like the Beyond's dependence of looking towards folks as like heroes or saviors on specific sides. I think that, people on the right can look at Trump, Musk, Vivek, all these guys as saviors, which is like not a healthy orientation. I think on the left, we can folks looking at AOC or Barack, or not so much Biden anymore. There's each side kind of like has its gods and heroes. It feels fairly consistent with what we know about groupthink if we actually take a step back and look at the criteria to categorize something as groupthink. Strong leaders, insulation from other viewpoints, active silencing of dissent, some of these qualities. We see qualities of those on both sides of the fence, which I think is concerning.
So you've got these kind of, these archetypes create kind of a pathology in group dynamics. How does that play out, specifically on left and right? How might those pathologies, manifest?
I think, well, like one way, I'm not sure if it's just left, right, but it's like, it's easily done by anybody. Could just be human nature, but it's like a cancel culture. You see clips of long form videos, online, snipped to the most controversial piece where it's used to cancel somebody based on like something they haven't said. I think there was one going around Donald Trump being like super racist.
Yeah, the very fine people thing.
Yeah, and like that was, and then I remember that was just like completely debunked, and it was just shown what this meant in the long form context. Yeah, but I'm not sure. I think there are personality proclivities, towards the left and the right. There obviously are. There's loads of literature on that.
There's the piece that we name Aodhan to is that I think it's fairly accurate to say that looking at what each side is wanting to disown at some level. And I think that the conservative side wants to project onto the left of like weakness, naivete, like kind of the sheep herd mentality of like, which is so weird from when we grew up. It's such a different shift, but like sucking at the government kind of mentality, socialist ideas. But this idea of like weakness and naivete, and it's like, hey, you hold this psychic material for us, and we're going to project that onto you. And then on the flip side, the progressives want to like outsource or project out.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the toxic masculinity or like abusiveness or over harshness and like the racism. Like, oh, I don't have any racism here. Like you have these biases, and I mean, if we're objective, like people have biases. These are heuristics that all of us use, right? Like on some level.
Yeah, I think as well. We get into it around cancel culture, but I think specifically it's very interesting, and maybe I'm seeing something that's not there, but I'm not sure that's the case, where I think a lot of this sort of political correctness, whether on either side, I get into it in the book. It comes from sort of this Simon Western. He's a scholar that talks about this. It comes from like a wounded self where they've been hurt and then they don't want anyone else to feel like this. So then this sort of it turns into almost a maniacal moral mission to not let anyone else feel the pain that they've felt. And then that's almost used to just treat somebody in crazy ways. But then they can't see that in themselves. They can't connect with this aggression that actually underlies that sort of impulse to hammer down or destroy an opposite opinion because they see the other as a bigot. This is something I've seen in group relations in people who are very left-leaning over and over and over, like heavy, and like in multiple times. It's like a heavy viciousness that they don't see. Like I see that over and over and over. It's very interesting, and it comes up and we talk about it.
Yeah,
and it's that's quite remarkable.
I think it was Jonathan Haidt who described that mentality as vindictive protectiveness. Like this idea that I am protecting you, therefore I'm allowed essentially unlimited rage and aggression because I've taken on that nurturing role. It's kind of a bizarre twist, but it makes sense from the logic of that philosophy, I guess.
Yeah, it connects with the drama triangle, I think is really helpful. It's like looking at, I think you could draw this for folks on both sides of the political aisle. But if we're looking at the left, I think that the drama triangle of the persecutor, victim, ally, you see folks like bending over backwards to like say, I'm an ally, or ally is not the word that Cartman uses. It's rescuer, right? But I think we can basically like change the wording and match really nicely with what goes on social media. Like rescuer equals ally, victim equals marginalized, persecutor equals oppressor or colonizer or whatever, right? It's just like altered, like substituted vocabulary for the drama triangle. I think it connects a little bit with what Gad said, at least calls the suicidal empathy type of drive, right? There's another piece. Oh, yeah, I lost it. But yeah, like the drama triangle, I think is actually an extremely helpful framework that I don't hear people invoke around political dynamics a ton. But like when 2020 happened, there was a pretty radical shift in some of those roles. And then we talk about that too. Like the drama triangle is like, it's like magnetic poles where under the right conditions, things can shift drastically and quickly to where the victim becomes the persecutor, right?
I think something that's fascinating about that, correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of a clinical discourse, a lot of times the rescuer is doing it for themselves more so than for the victim. And I see this so much with progressives, like, look at me, a good white person, I need to save you Latinx people. You know, it's like, why are you calling us Latinx, you know, or pushing for certain immigration policies or crime policies that minorities are not pushing for. And it's like, no, let me be the good savior here.
Well, and what we talk about is the rescuer is actually becomes invested in keeping the victim weak. That's part of the fantasy, right? So the victim is projecting on the persecutor, like, you're the bad person and I'm innocent. And so it's like, I like to think of like, what are the fantasies of each position there? And the persecutor draws, there's something nice about you're important when you're the villain. You're also powerful and you get to own this fantasy of being competent and powerful, and your efforts towards whatever beautiful mission you have in mind are being sabotaged by the victim. Yeah. And the victim is like, well, you're the bad guy or whatever, and you're misguided and evil and like oppressing me, and that the ally or the rescuer is invested in keeping the victim weak and needing help. And I think it's important to say that this is largely unconscious, right? Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So
that's exactly.
Don't really mean to do this, but because I don't want it to come across like as if it's almost like, no, you're doing this directly. But yeah, like even Brant, we were at an event recently in Norway, and it's like we walk into like an environment event, and it's like this exact same situation happens where it's like, no, we are the ones who know, and we're going to give you this knowledge that you need to know, and you have to get in line. And everyone is just like, yes, please give me the knowledge. I'm all here with, I'm also on your side. Yeah, I don't know. It's vindictive, and it's almost like you know more than the minority or whatever, slot into this position.
Well, the other thing too is that this is not to say that all helping behavior is toxic. I think that's to preempt any comments that might pop up. The extent it becomes an entrenched group dynamic when those three roles are crystallized. And also my metric for asking, like, is this a group dynamic, is, you hinted at it, Ryan. The rescuer is doing what they're doing to alleviate their own anxiety. So the extent to which that helping behavior is to alleviate anxiety or discomfort, or it's a defense mechanism on the part of the rescuer, typically that's going to be unhealthy. And again, it's unconscious.
It's narcissistic supply, I think, is the word. It's like they're filling something for themselves, but it can be very subtle and like unknown. And often that's, people are pulled into that and they develop a resentment over this, is what I see too, almost needing to do something compulsively to help. Anyways.
I'm wondering, this is what comes up for me, but I'm wondering if it resonates with you, like almost an OCD type response. This kind of, the rescuer is like, am I a persecutor? Am I the bad guy? Like, am I secretly having racist thoughts or homophobic thoughts or misogynistic thoughts? And you kind of have to channel that from the obsession into some kind of ritual. So it's not hand washing or checking locks. It's, I have to call someone else a racist. I have to channel this outside of me into you.
Yeah, I mean,
interesting. Yeah,
projection. I don't know enough to comment on like how that fits in with like an actual formal diagnosis of OCD, but that's projection in a nutshell for sure.
Yeah, like and like the group relations work. Like again, it's like it calls you to look at all of this in yourself. It's like, where are you racist? Where are you homophobic? Where are you doing all of these things in yourself? And own that, because
that's where I do think at least certain strands of conservatism miss the mark too. Is that the reactionary response is not helpful around like there really is some importance into our different pieces of identity that we bring into groups. It does impact group dynamics in a pretty profound way. That is different than becoming, like, what we see on the other side is just like an utter preoccupation with like skin deep diversity kind of stuff that is really ends up being harmful for groups, right? Like there's research on that. It's not helpful. But on the flip side of that, I think I've seen like a pretty, almost like a mocking denial of that there's any importance to that stuff, which I don't agree with. I think that those pieces, like when somebody walks in the room, how they look, it's not just how they look, how they carry themselves, their accent, all these things are a part of it, but certainly how they look is a piece of the puzzle that changes like the room's energy and how I feel and how the person next to me feels. Like these are real effects that happen. And so I like the group relations lens because it does invite us to ask some of those questions and bring some of that into the consciousness. But
yes, it allows you to actually bring up these things that are just completely taboo in many like rooms in society. I know Leslie had a crazy story that I'm not sure about sharing, but like
I got a lot of this.
Yeah, he was in Israel at a conference, and Leslie is a 6'5", like whatever, I don't know his weight, but like a giant black guy, like he's massive, right? So he appears and he's incredibly eloquent English accent, PhD education. So like he kind of throws people off in how he looks and how he comes into a room. And he was at a conference in Israel, and a woman said to him, Leslie, something like this: I see you, you're very educated and eloquent, but I just see you as a big black man. Literally said that to him at the conference. And the purpose was to explore why, and to get to the root of this. And to be able to like even say that is crazy. It's like a crazy thing to think about now. It's like, I'm worried about saying that now. It's like, why? Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about, like, we talked a little bit about the kind of, I guess, the woke abuse or pathology of these type of dynamics. You touched on it. Can you say a little bit more about the backlash that we see from the right against this social justice identity politics?
Yeah. Aodhan and I've been talking about this more with both Aodhan and a couple of other friends. Like, this may not be as much observation as like fear of the future. Ryan, you and I, right before we started, hit the record button, I think we're getting into this a little bit. I'm fearful that there could be pretty intense counter woke, militant counter woke waves that come through based on some of the news stories and how they're received. Like it's strictly like specific the Rotterdam stuff that's coming out right now, and some of it's like the inverted hierarchy stuff that you write about, Aodhan, with social media posts being jailable offenses in the UK, and the scandal with Rotterdam coming out. I'm like reading some of the comments, and I try not to get too far down that rabbit hole, but one concept that is important is that when we repress material as a group, when we really try to shove it down, it behaves like a gas, like we're compressing a gas. And eventually, when it finds that little point of rupture, it comes out violently, sideways, in a way that's not controlled, in a way that reinforces our fears and validates in our minds, like, oh, see, I knew that stuff was not safe. If you're in a group and there's a strict taboo about talking about attraction, and you're really trying to tightly control that energy, you're probably going to see it manifest as like an underground sexual encounter with group members or something like that, that then erodes trust in the group or like clearly violates boundaries. And because it manifested in an inappropriate way, in that example, that group view that it's inappropriate material and it's like toxic to touch is reinforced. And so we use the metaphor of like Cronus swallowing the gods, and then eventually Zeus like poisoning him so that he spits the ball back out, and then they end up overthrowing him. So it's like that stuff that we try to swallow and shove down in there ends up being our undoing effectively. And I think a lot of people who are moderate or slightly conservative, socially conservative at least, have learned to not speak about certain beliefs in professional contexts, depending on which profession you're in, right? Like certain professions, probably folks on the liberal side have felt this way in conservative environments as well. But I think there's a lot of anger that's has not found room for expression. My concern is that, historically, that can really lead to extreme movements that are damaging, right? Like if we're not, it's like the wildfire management metaphor, right? Like if you're not doing controlled burns in the forest and working with that material, you're going to have a massive forest fire. And yeah, it's scary stuff. I do think there's a sense of deep anger that hasn't found root for expression. And I think that folks I think that the amount of times we see the mainstream media distorting the truth on certain pieces or like misleading in some way just with phrasing, where's that going? I think that is like part of like fueling this just anger towards the machine in a way. And yeah, I worry a little bit about that, like a strong, self-righteous, angry backlash that could come.
Well, it's exactly why people like Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes are popular. This sort of like almost shaking, angry at the current establishment energy is like, oh yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I feel. So let's go down here. That guy is a solution,
Yeah, it's the Joaquin Phoenix Joker meme, right? Where, we love that meme of like, you get what you fucking deserve, Mark, whatever. Like the unhinged, like the violent, unhinged nature of that. Yeah, in context of cinema, and it speaks to us because it's saying something that's true in a way.
I think it's. Sorry, go on.
No, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's super difficult for me, like as well. Like I'm obviously in this too. I'm on Twitter. I get stuck down these rabbit holes. I'm like, I feel it, and I'm fed up with this kind of stuff. But like the group relations stuff, like sitting in a room with people who don't think like you at all, is like so powerful. Like that example with Leslie I just explained, because you really just get to see the human stripped of all of these roles and identities that we have and we like to use in our groups. So when you strip all of that away and you have to sit in front of a person and just like talk to them, it just does magic. You come away like from these conferences, and you don't need to do this at a conference, obviously, but you come away with deeper friendships, like, and it goes the opposite way too, but deeper friendships, like very, very deep friendships. But there's something in there about like the depolarization process of being able to sit there and talk about these things rather than them building up and just exploding.
That's what Braver Angels does. Do you know about them, Ryan?
Yeah.
John Wood Jr. Yeah. I'm a shout out. I'll figure out the time mark, but yeah, he's a awesome dude. And I know they've been doing a lot of that work. I was following them pretty closely around 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I had a guest on here not too long ago, and I won't say his name. I really like the guy, but there's one thing he said that just kind of tipped off a little red flag in my head. And he said communism is like a plague or a virus, something like that. And he said the authoritarian right is like an immune response. And we need just enough authoritarianism on the right to defeat communism so that the immune system becomes healthy again. And I tend to see myself as a classical liberal, and that really scares me. Like we need just enough authoritarianism to make us healthy again. But at the same time, like I see my position of let's just give everybody free speech and let's just have this free, open, tolerant society. It's a less defensible position when you've got very, kind of authoritarian tendencies on left and right. I'm wondering if that's your value, how do you hold that line? How do you hold that value?
I mean, I nowadays kind of go straight from that question into thinking about it from an archetypal lens. And I think, Aodhan, we were asked in one of the podcasts we did recently around which archetype is missing in most glaring capacity in our society. And our answer was the king archetype. The king archetype, as Gillette and Moore describe it, is generative. There are qualities, right? Like for the king archetype, one of them is around establishing and holding boundaries, which is different than authoritarianism. I think it's like pretty important to draw a line between the authoritarian and authoritative styles of leadership, right? So we, at least many of us, have become so suspicious of the idea of boundaries and rules and regulations, and we've lost so much trust in institutions because we're not seeing that king energy. And I don't mean that it has to be a man. King energy is like this archetype from like a post-Jungian perspective, where just like certain qualities of leadership, we're seeing a rise in Trump, for example, is more of like a response to the system. It's like a in your face, like we're not going to take it kind of, came back with a zinger. Now let's clip it, throw it on YouTube. People are either enraged or super stoked on it. That's not king energy, and we're missing that, right? But I know Jordan Peterson has this talk. It's been a long time since I've heard about it, but he talks about the pretty much what you're saying, Ryan, around like the containing function of each side of the political spectrum and how they're supposed to end up being like a check and balances there. Like the left is supposed to challenge the right and keep us somewhat open to new ideas and progress, right? And the right is in charge of, like, if we were an organism, the right is in charge of upholding certain traditions that have like a deep function that may not be conscious, but is really important, right? And so there's like this dynamic interplay. Sure, but I really think in terms of the archetypal, we're just not seeing many leaders that embody that king energy. Even like, what's his name, Polyev in Canada, right? Like Trudeau just resigned. Polyev, I remember like listening to the first interview with him where he's eating that apple, right? And it's hilarious.
Swagger.
Yeah. And so there's part of me where I'm like, oh, that's like cool, grounded energy. But as I've watched, first of all, the Canadian, what is it, House of Commons or whatever they do is insane. Yeah. It's like a roast battle. This is the first year I've paid attention to that, and they just like go at each other. But that's not king energy. We're not manifesting like a leader that is uniting. That was the other piece, right? The key piece of king energy is generativity and uniting and like keeping the kingdom united. And so what we're instead celebrating and manifesting is like incomplete king energy, really effectively like warrior energy parading around as king energy, right? Like this divisive stuff that excites your fan base.
Kind of like Achilles.
Yes, say more.
It's sort of like Achilles, just, or not Achilles, Agamemnon. It's like this guy is out for himself, and then Achilles gets sick of him, but he's out for himself, really. He's not really out for unifying the culture. We'll say something like that.
The king energy seems almost impossible to conceptualize where we are right now, because if I said, hey, I want to unify the country, I've got this huge group of people saying, you're asking me to unify with Nazis, and another group of people saying, you're asking me to unify with communists. It's like there's such an incompatibility in how we even talk about these things that it's hard to even start that process.
Yeah, and this is why I think this type of work is helpful and important, because we need to be able to answer those questions. We, in the book, talk about some of the work that Nelson Mandela did
No,
dealing with like post-apartheid. And yeah, it's a real question of like, what is the way back? Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, people have hit some strange things on either side. What is the way back to a cohesive society? Well, in my personal life, if I feel wronged, I'm a person and I'm like, I want justice or whatever. But from a societal lens and hopefully more and more in personal life too, I think that answering the question of like, how do I create a better world, or what Simon Western calls like, how do we get to the good life, so to speak? How do we take these wise steps towards a future that is those things, that is a more united society where people can be safe and also express opinions and live together? How do we do that? And it's not, the answer is not going to be enough justice. Enough justice is not what's going to get us there.
I'm thinking the more and more, I need to do more thinking around this, but I think it's like Jonathan Pajot, his response to this question is tell better stories. And then I guess people would say, well, you're just spreading another ideology. That's all you're doing. But and I don't know how to answer that question. But like, for example, Jonathan Pajot is literally he's started to publish fairy tales into the culture again. That sort of helped heal this sort of divide at a very core, deep, archetypal, psychological level. Like telling stories that unite in some healthy way. Like that seems like one of the best options.
And
it's sitting together in a room and talking.
I'll say another piece that may even sound contradictory to what Aodhan and I just said, though. I do think that there's a real threat to prematurely, artificially resolving conflict. You know?
Say more.
So if the bedrock isn't laid down, if it's forced, if it's not a thorough, genuine resolution to some of these things, like, and there's not an energetic shift, then I think that any sort of imposed resolution is likely to not stick.
It's repressing that energy like you were talking about earlier.
Right, exactly. I suspect that we're going to hit a point of either societal just fatigue around all of this fighting and like polarization. And I almost imagine that from any individual's perspective, it's going to be, I think you can go one of two ways. So this is like scenario A. Almost like an inexplicable relaxation where, you know, there's just less animosity and we can't point to one thing as to why, but just on a society, there's a shift towards, yeah, look, I know that I'm a conservative and you were really fighting for whatever ideology that I don't agree with on that side, and you posted these things on social media and I have receipts, damn it, but I'm just like tired of fighting. Like, can we get back to like being in community? I think that could happen. I don't think it will be some grandiose event in that case. I think that a lot of times these groups are just like something shifts and it's hard to even point to what it is. Maybe there will be some big thing where have you seen those AI videos of like Trump and Biden like fishing together and like feeding each other cake and stuff? You know, who knows, man. And then I think the other scenario that I think is somewhat likely and way scarier is that we see like an eruption of counter-woke violence, and there are just way more people down with it than we think. And I'll be bold. I'm just going to be honest with you. Like, I'm imagining nightmarish. I would say that these are nightmarish scenarios because it would be not a part of what I would call a stable society at this point.
Yeah.
Not. I don't mean like we'd be in Mad Max world, but it'd be destabilizing to have. I'm just imagining like gangs like going in and dragging out political rivals in the street and like violence in the street, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's on the table, honestly.
That's really scary. Yeah, that's incredibly scary. And honestly, like with the way things are escalating, you know, in this last election, you know, I don't know how many articles there were that Donald Trump is literally the incarnation of Hitler. Kamala Harris is a communist who's going to destroy America. It's like all the rhetoric gets cranked up to 11, constantly nonstop blaring, you know, and you hear this stuff and you talk about like the assassination of President Trump. You know, I grew up with this philosophical thought experiment. If it's 1940 and you're in Germany, would you kill Hitler? And the answer is, of course, you could save millions of lives if you kill Hitler. And now people are being told you have that opportunity right now. Like, why are you surprised that people are taking it? You know, it's like we're, at least in our heads, living in 1940 Germany just every day.
Yeah. Yeah. It's scary stuff for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm reminded there's a old school dude I'm reading right now named Wilfred Trotter. He has a book, I think it's called, what is it? It's like Actions of the Herd in Peace and War, or something like that. So this was back, there were a few thinkers. There was Gustav Le Bon, who has some pretty wild out views that are, you can have a sense of humor. It's funny to like read the back of his book and you're just like, my God, I can't. There's a reason why you don't hear his name anymore. I'll say that. But so then Freud published some stuff on books. He did Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, and then there's Wilfred Trotter. These were like the three that I'm aware of, at least the three like pieces of the three works that preceded Jung getting involved with group dynamic stuff, and then proceeded Beyond's application of Kleinian thinking. But one of the things that he talks about is the herd mentality, and just the big word of the day that you never hear anymore is suggestibility. And he talks about there's just this extreme cohesive force that ensnares most people around normative behavior towards what's accepted in the herd. And yeah, I mean, it's scary if that stuff starts to become untethered, or if the Overton window in whatever, even like the mini Overton window in like the progressive sphere is suggestive of violence in any way, or characterizing, Trump as like Hitler, for example, is like a pretty far place to go. That becomes concerning because you're starting to, like you're hinting at, you're norming more and more extreme behavior. I think we see it on both sides. I think that there are ways of that. If you just go down if you don't have psychic defenses in place and you just go down the Twitter feed and are seeing like some of the anti-Islamic commentary, it's scary. You can imagine that this doesn't lead to like peaceful resolution.
Yeah. Matthias Desmet, the guy who wrote The Psychology of Totalitarianism.
Yes.
He called that, like, he's like basically free-floating anxiety. He called it mass formation. Free-floating anxiety in a culture, and then it attaches to an object that everyone can just unite around. And then he calls that mass formation. And I think that's the sort of thing that's kind of at play. I think he's a pretty interesting thinker on this.
It's also Franz de Waal's observation with chimps, right? Like
Oh yeah,
he's great, man. RNRA, that book. I wrote to him when we were putting out our book, and I was like, "Hey, man, you got to read this." And he was like, "I don't do human psychology," kind of thing. Whatever. But I think his work is extremely applicable. But there's just these two. There's internal scapegoating, intra-group scapegoating, and then there's like inter-group scapegoating or external scapegoating. Like you'll see chimps will pick on one member and corner them and scream at them, corner them into the cage and scream at them. And then if you take that member out, they'll just like figure out who the next member is to scream at. But if things reach a breaking point, or if it's just in a slightly different intergroup milieu, they'll instead all unite around screaming at the lions in the cage next door. Right. And so it's that type of scapegoating works to increase group consolidation and cohesiveness, right? The projecting outwards, whereas the scapegoating projecting inwards seems to do something different for the group. But it is like we're all united in like yelling at that damn tiger over there.
That is wild that scapegoating tendency seems to be hardwired among primates. That's wild. So I've got two more questions for you. And the first one, I would like you, since y'all are mythology guys, to entertain my amateur harebrained mythology theory, if you would. So my theory, if you'll hear me out, is that Homer was the original catalyst for the scientific revolution. So here's my hypothesis. If you're reading the Iliad and then later on the Odyssey, it's almost kind of tough to see who the protagonist is. Like, is he trying to say that, Paris's romantic passions, like that's probably not it. Maybe Hector, he's a very chivalrous guy, but then he gets killed by Achilles. So is Achilles, is that is it just brute strength? Is that what? But, after the Iliad ends, then the Trojan War comes to an end when Odysseus has the Trojan horse idea. So it's wisdom that ended the Trojan War. So I think Homer's trying to tell us that wisdom is the greatest virtue. Who would have grown up hearing those stories about how wisdom is the greatest virtue? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So they were read for a while in their day, and they were kind of lost. And then right before the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, people started reading Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle again. So that's my kind of wild conspiracy connection there.
Yeah. I mean, undoubtedly those stories impacted many extremely influential thinkers through that period of history. Yes. I mean, I'll think on that for sure. I think it's an interesting theory. Cool.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say on that. I did study the classics, but it seems like you're more studied on them than I am.
I'm a big fan of the Greeks. I like them, so that's why I'm very much enjoying our conversation. Last question I have for you is, and I want you each to answer this individually. What is one thing that we're not talking about that we should be talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got into some of it on this podcast. And my metric for that is that I've, throughout this conversation, had a few moments where I'm like, man, am I saying too much here? I feel, uncomfortable putting certain pieces out there. I'm like an Enneagram 8, if you know what that is, or like I'm a contrarian. I like to challenge things. I like to I'm not usually afraid of conflict. I really will get into it. And I still notice myself having some reservations around, like, I don't even think I said anything that I would even term as controversial, but the temperature is so hot that having opinions and expressing opinions about like what we're seeing in the group dynamics, like I think exploring conflict, exploring naming some of these roles, it still feels volatile. It still feels hot to me. So I don't know if that's like a super clean answer, but I think well, I'll say this. I think it's off limits to be in the middle ground too. I think that's one way to like make everyone.
There's a number of quotes. There's Howard Zinn's, "You can't be neutral on a moving train," and then or you can't sit still on a moving train. And then there was a Desmond Tutu that says neutrality takes the side of the oppressor. You hear, especially coming from the left, it's like white silence is violence. Not taking a position is like the worst thing possible. It's just as bad as
You'll also get it from the right. Like they'll call you names too. I think.
Yeah.
Well, and I understand too. I do think that there is certainly a type of neutrality that is cowardice. I think that's true. What scares me a little bit is that if we don't have an ability to bring in that uniting king energy, like I have political opinions. I also want to preserve like the ability to be somewhat of like a group analyst at some level. And so it's a hard dance, I think it's a messy thing to do, to try to like preserve analytical capacity while we are also, human participants in the system. Right, like it's a dual role thing. If I can maybe think on your question for another second, you asked, what is the big thing we're not talking about that we should be? Is that basically it?
Yeah.
And you're on Twitter, so much is being talked about on a scale from reasonably discussed to completely unhinged and insane. It's hard. It's not something that isn't getting attention, but I'm pretty fascinated by the fall of trust in the media. We look at the myth of like Amaterasu as a Shinto goddess that is like shoved into the cave by the storm goddess or by the storm god Susanoo, and in many myths when the primary god or the god of like Persephone, for example, or the god of like rejuvenative forces is locked away in the underworld or in a cave, but the land languishes, right? Like there's like we're seeing that, man. Like I don't trust media. I don't trust mainstream media. I assume I've caught them lying to me enough to where I'm like, man, I don't know what to trust. And that seems dangerous and somewhat scary to me, that there's not trusted information. Like we've lost the function of how we gather information and how we orient ourselves in the world. Not good,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as I'm like applying to a bunch of like graduate programs and things like this, and yeah, it's like I can feel that same, like I'm almost afraid to say things here, and I just don't think that's good. I don't think that's good. Like, yeah, I don't know. I see it's quite a common thing to, that all these sorts of the EDI pushes, they almost turn into like some sort of a totalitarian thing in themselves. There's some evidence to say they don't actually resolve anything by making these the center of our attention. It actually doesn't do anything. It just creates more divide. Yeah, I don't know. I just think that's pretty important to talk about, to make it somewhat like safe to talk about, to use that horrible word.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Those are good, very interesting answers. I like that. Well, if y'all could hang out for just a second until the upload finishes, but Aodhan, Brant, really loved having a conversation. This was fascinating. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man. Thanks
No
for having
problem.
us.
Thanks.
Good combo.